On the night of August 25th, 2010, 49-year-old Jacqueline Kodarak stood swaying on the doorstep of her boyfriend's home in Bakersfield, California, pounding furiously on the door. Jacqueline was a respected physician, but that night she overindulged in alcohol and, driven by desperation, went to confront her partner. But when she grabbed a shovel to smash the door, 58-year-old William Moody slipped quietly out the back, locking the house behind him. Yet Jacqueline was determined to get inside at any cost, a decision that soon turned fatally against her. 3 days later, a house sitter noticed a foul stench seeping in from the fireplace. When firefighters dismantled the chimney, they discovered something unthinkable: Jacqueline's lifeless body, wedged and suffocated in her attempt to reach the man she loved. This case, like the 12 others we'll cover today, is almost impossible to believe. So bizarre, so recklessly foolish, and yet tragically real. If you missed the first part of this series, it should appear on your screen. But for now, as always, viewer discretion is advised. On July 2nd, 2011, in the small town of Onondaga, New York, hundreds of bikers gathered for one main reason: to protest the state's mandatory helmet law. Roaring down Route 11, nearly 550 motorcycles carved a path through traffic, most of them proudly bareheaded. None more proudly than 55-year-old Philip A. Contos. Philip was a former Army serviceman and lifelong rider who saw helmets as nothing more than government overreach. That day, he climbed onto his 1983 Harley-Davidson, of course, with no helmet in sight, because for him, that was the point. But in the most painfully ironic twist imaginable, that decision would be his last. As traffic slowed ahead, Philip braked hard. Suddenly, his Harley fishtailed. The rear tire lost traction, and in an instant, he was airborne, launched over the handlebars and crashing headfirst into the pavement. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was, unfortunately, too late. The impact had fractured his skull, causing fatal blunt force trauma. And later, doctors confirmed the bitter truth. Philip almost certainly would have survived if only he had worn a helmet. And yet, even after his death, Abate, the very biker group that organized the rally, didn't back down. They mourned Philip, but doubled down on their mission, insisting it's about the principle. Principles are one thing, but the open road is hardly the place to gamble with your life, where even a single wrong turn can bring the unthinkable, just as it did in the next case. On December 26, 1997, the city of Sorocaba, São Paulo, was buzzing with holiday travelers. Meanwhile, at the smallest municipal airport, a twin-prop plane lined up for its final approach, with engines roaring as it descended toward the runway. But just meters below, a lone 25-year-old cyclist named Marcelo pedaled calmly across the tarmac. He had chosen the airport as a shortcut on his way home. A risky move on any day, but especially dangerous now. To make matters worse, he was wearing headphones, blasting music through his Walkman, completely oblivious to the massive aircraft bearing down on him from the sky. The pilot spotted Marcelo at the very last second. He tried to correct the landing, pulling the nose upward, but there was simply no time to spare. In one horrifying instant, the spinning propeller and wing of the plane struck the young man directly. The impact was catastrophic. Marcelo died instantly, with his body hurled aside as the aircraft skidded down the runway. And in that moment, the horrified pilot and crew could only sit frozen in disbelief, realizing the victim hadn't even looked up once. The man from the next case, however, wasn't taking a shortcut. He was chasing views for TikTok and ended up face to face with an obstacle at highway speed. It was the morning rush hour in Houston, Texas on November 10, 2022. Commuters packed the EastX freeway with engines rumbling beneath the Tuam Street overpass. Most people were just trying to get to work on time, but one 25-year-old man had very different plans. He had secretly climbed onto the roof of a moving 18-wheeler, phone in hand, ready to film himself for TikTok. Meanwhile, the massive semi roared along the freeway, completely unaware of the stowaway on his roof. And for a few surreal minutes, drivers all around watched in shock as the young man began to dance, striking poses, moving to music only he could hear, and smiling as cars sped past. But there was one thing he didn't see: the looming concrete bridge directly ahead. The collision was instant and brutal. Within seconds, he was slammed off the roof and thrown violently onto the freeway below, landing amidst the speeding cars. Traffic screeched to a halt, with horns blaring, as horrified drivers swerved to avoid running over his motionless body. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed him to the hospital. but his injuries were catastrophic. The blunt force trauma from both the overpass and the fall had already sealed the TikToker's fate. And while one man risked everything for internet fame, the next two young men would pay the ultimate price for love. It was the Mid-Autumn Festival of 2004 in Taiwan, a night meant for lanterns, mooncakes, and gathering with friends under the full moon. But for two 20-year-old university classmates, the celebration spiraled into a reckless challenge. Although they barely spoke outside of class, the boys had one thing in common: an infatuation with the same female student. And that night, they decided her attention would be won not with flowers or poems, but with speed and steel. Each climbed onto his scooter, with helmets strapped and engines revving in the warm night air. The rules were absurdly simple. Ride directly at each other head-on. Whoever swerved away first would be branded the coward. The winner, in turn, would claim the right to pursue the girl. At first, the scooters crept forward, but within seconds, both riders were barreling toward each other at nearly 80 kilometers per hour. The gap closed fast, and still, neither one swerved. The impact was devastating. The two machines collided with bone-crushing force, hurling both riders into the air before slamming them lifeless onto the asphalt. Witnesses screamed and rushed forward, but by then both classmates were already dead from massive blunt force trauma. And what about the girl at the center of it all? Well, when reporters asked her afterward, she simply shook her head and admitted she had never been interested in either of them. Meanwhile, the man in our next case wasn't taking any risks. He just wanted to grab a quick fast food meal. It was a quiet September morning in Vancouver in 2021, and the McDonald's drive-thru on Main Street buzzed with its usual line of cars. Families picked up breakfast, commuters grabbed coffee, and in the middle of it all, a small SUV idled patiently at the pavement window. Behind the wheel was a 42-year-old father of two, Tony Isles. He rolled down his window, smiled politely at the cashier, and reached for his bank card. But suddenly it slipped from his hand and fell to the ground beneath the car. Wanting to grab it quickly, Tony opened his door and leaned out. In that single moment, everything went incredibly wrong. His SUV wasn't fully in park, and as Tony bent forward, his foot shifted ever so slightly off the brake. In an instant, the vehicle lurched forward with a violent jolt. The open door swung into the thick metal support post of the drive-thru, and Tony, caught between the door and the frame, was crushed instantly. Bystanders screamed as they watched the horrific scene unfold. McDonald's employees rushed out, some trying desperately to push the car back, others frantically calling 911. But despite all efforts, Tony Isles was pronounced dead at the scene, with his life ended by a split-second mistake in the most mundane of places. Meanwhile, the next man was just coming home from a barbecue with the smoke still lingering in his car. On a Friday evening in July 2022, the quiet German town of Erftstadt was suddenly rattled by a loud crash. Locals rushed outside to find a car that had slammed into the wall of a small residential building. When police and firefighters arrived minutes later, they expected to find the usual causes of such an accident: speeding, alcohol, maybe a medical emergency. But as soon as they opened the driver's door, an unmistakable scent hit them: burning charcoal. Inside the vehicle, ash coated the upholstery. Several kettle grills were wedged into the back seat, still glowing faintly with orange embers. Meanwhile, beer benches, plates, and cooking utensils were scattered across the floor, as if someone had hastily packed up an entire barbecue. And slumped over the wheel, unconscious, was the driver, a 38-year-old local chef known for hosting grill seminars. Rescuers pulled him from the wreck and tried desperately to revive him right there on the pavement. But despite their efforts, he never regained consciousness. Investigators later pieced together the tragic chain of events. The man had likely wrapped up a grilling event and, instead of waiting for the coals to burn out, loaded the still-lit grills into his car. As he drove through the quiet neighborhood, the charcoal filled the sealed cabin with carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless killer. Within minutes, it overwhelmed him. He blacked out, lost control of the wheel, and ultimately succumbed to poisoning before the crash. The preparation of the next meal we'll cover ended in tragedy too, this time almost for an entire family. On April 9th, 2020, inside a modest family home in Tamil Nadu, India, 4 relatives sat down together for a comforting meal. On the table was Mysore Bonda, South India's favorite crisp golden fritters, freshly fried, steaming, and fragrant. For a few minutes, the room was filled with chatter, laughter, and the crunch of those first bites. But in an instant, everything changed. One by one, family members began to falter. First, 22-year-old Bharati clutched her stomach, with her face suddenly drained of color. Then her husband, 27-year-old Siva Kumar, doubled over in pain. Moments later, his parents, Periyasamy and Lakshmi, were struck with the same searing cramps. Panic erupted at the dinner table. 4 people, all violently ill at once, gasping and retching, unable to understand what was happening. Neighbors heard the screams and rushed in. Within minutes, ambulances carried the family to the nearest hospital, but tragically, not everyone could be saved. Upon arrival, Bharati and Siva, newlyweds, with their marriage barely weeks old, died from acute poisoning. Amazingly, the parents survived after intensive care, though they lingered on the brink for days. But what actually happened? As it later turned out, Periyasamy had returned from the market earlier that day carrying a bag of maida flour for the bondas. But next to it, on the same kitchen counter, he had placed a second bag, powdered pesticide, meant for the family's farm. So when Bharati began cooking, she unknowingly mixed the two together, lacing the bondas with lethal chemicals, where even a fraction of a gram could kill an adult. The man in our next case also miscalculated the proportions, accidentally turning an everyday drink into a deadly cocktail. In January 2022, 29-year-old personal trainer Tom Mansfield was preparing a pre-workout drink at home in Colwyn Bay, Wales. Like many fitness enthusiasts, he used pure caffeine powder as a supplement. The instructions called for a precise dose, just 60 to 300 milligrams. But Tom didn't have the right measuring tools. Instead, he relied on kitchen scales that only started at 2 grams. That tiny detail proved catastrophic. Instead of scooping out a safe amount, Tom accidentally measured out nearly 300 grams of caffeine, hundreds of times the recommended dose. For context, that's the equivalent of almost 200 cups of coffee consumed at once. He stirred the powder into the water, took a few gulps, and almost immediately felt his heart racing out of control. He clutched his chest, gasped for air, and collapsed right in front of his wife, Susanna, foaming at the mouth. Paramedics rushed to the scene and fought desperately to bring him back, shocking his heart again and again with a defibrillator for 45 agonizing minutes. But unfortunately, nothing worked, and Tom Mansfield was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The postmortem revealed his blood caffeine concentration was 392 milligrams per liter, 5 times the fatal threshold of 78 milligrams per liter. The next case also began in the kitchen, but instead of a drink gone wrong, it involved a man trying to enter his own home in the most bizarre way imaginable. On the night of May 26, 2004, a man in the Austrian town of Wolfsburg stumbled home after hours of heavy drinking. When he reached his apartment building, he began fumbling through his pockets in a desperate attempt to find his keys. Convinced he'd lost them in a drunken haze, he made his way around the side of the building and fixed his eyes on the small kitchen window, deciding it would be the easiest way to get inside. He hoisted himself up, wedged his head and torso through the frame, and began pushing forward. But halfway in, his body became stuck, with his chest compressed tightly above the sink. Struggling and flailing to break free, he accidentally knocked the faucet handle. In an instant, hot water began gushing into the basin directly beneath him. Pinned, exhausted, and unable to move, he could do nothing as the sink slowly filled. The next morning, the apartment manager noticed the man's legs dangling stiffly from the window and immediately called the police. Inside, they uncovered the grim reality. The man had drowned, with his head submerged in the still running water. And in the cruelest irony, the missing keys he thought he'd lost were right there in his pants pocket. And while water was the deadly element in this case, the next one shows that sometimes it's not the water itself you should fear, but the predators lurking inside. On the morning of May 31st, 2022, in Largo, Florida, a man walking his dog along the edge of Taylor Lake stopped dead in his tracks. Just ahead, something pale and lifeless floated near the reeds. At first, he thought it might be debris, but as he stepped closer, the truth hit him with a wave of horror. It was a human body. The corpse was in terrible condition, missing limbs, torn and battered as though ripped apart by some enormous force. And only a few meters away, wearing a weathered sign read in bold letters, "Warning of alligators." The victim was 47-year-old Sean McGinnis, a man known locally for his unusual hobby. Every day, he would wade chest deep into the murky waters of Taylor Lake, ignoring both posted warnings and rangers' repeated attempts to stop him. His goal was to retrieve lost frisbees from the disc golf course that bordered the water. Players often overshot the baskets, sending discs sailing into the lake. McGinnis, in turn, collected them by the dozen and resold them for a few bucks apiece. On that night, alone in the darkness, he slipped into the water once more. At one point, A massive alligator had struck, pulling him under and tearing his body apart, while Sean fell victim to a predator he underestimated. The man in our next case didn't just ignore the danger of a wild beast. He deliberately provoked one. And this time, his opponent wasn't a reptile in a Florida lake, but the most fearsome predator in the Siberian wilderness. In early December 1997, deep in the frozen forests of Primoria, Russia, a poacher named Vladimir Markov set his sights on one of the world's rarest animals, the Amur tiger. Towering nearly 3 meters in length and weighing over 200 kilograms, these big cats are among the most dangerous apex predators. And that winter day, Markov stumbled upon a tiger's fresh kill, a wild boar lying in the snow. Instead of leaving, he made a fateful choice. He raised his rifle, fired at the tiger itself, wounding it, and then dragged away part of its meal. But the wounded tiger survived. And over the next 48 hours, it did something investigators would later describe as chillingly deliberate. It tracked Markov's scent for kilometers, following every trace back to his small cabin. Once there, the tiger destroyed everything in the yard and inside that carried his smell. Boots, tools, even walls smeared with his scent. So when Markov eventually returned home, rifle slung over his shoulder, he never stood a chance. The tiger ambushed him at the door with ruthless precision, killing him on the spot before dragging his body into the forest. And by the time authorities arrived, all that remained were fragments, blood, bone, and scrapes of his belongings. And while the poacher met his end at the claws of one of Earth's most fearsome predators, the final case in our list proves that sometimes you don't need a tiger, a gator, or even bad luck. Sometimes all it takes is a plastic bag and one tragically foolish idea. It was September 23, 2002, when a local farmer decided he'd had enough of the bees nesting in one of his orange trees in rural Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hiring a professional was too costly, so he devised his own plan: burn the hive out himself. But before striking the match, he needed protection. In his mind, the solution was simple. He taped his clothes tightly at the wrists and ankles to seal out the stingers, and for his head, he pulled a large plastic bag over it, fastening it snugly around his neck. It would keep the smoke out, the bees away, and, he believed, keep him safe. With that, torch in hand, he marched toward the hive. Hours later, when the man still hadn't returned, his wife grew worried and went searching for him in the grove. What she discovered was truly devastating. Her husband lay motionless on the ground, with the plastic bag still sealed around his head, the one in which he had forgotten to cut even the smallest holes for air. Today's cases show just how quickly arrogance, stubbornness, or even a single careless miscalculation can spiral into catastrophe. And while many of them seem almost absurd, they're also sobering reminders of just how fragile life really is when we take reckless risks or make foolish, spur-of-the-moment decisions. Now let me ask you, which of these stories struck you as the most unbelievable? And do you know of any similar cases you'd like me to cover in future video? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories, ones that might just keep you from becoming the star of a Darwin Award yourself.